By the time Maren Coyle had welded the 40th brace into the old grain silo, half the county had a name for what she was doing out there alone. They slowed their trucks at the property line, engines still running, and watched a woman half their size climbing scaffolding she'd built herself. They laughed the way men laugh when they've already decided how a story ends before it's finished. 2 years later, those same men would stand in a February wind and watch that silo hold steady, while 3 others on neighboring farms buckled under the weight of an ice storm nobody saw coming. And the man who mocked her loudest of all would be the one standing at her gate afterward, cap in his hands, asking how in the world a woman who'd never touched a torch before that spring had known exactly where the old steel was going to fail first. 2 years earlier, none of that had happened yet. Maren stood in the shadow of the silo with a flashlight and a legal pad, writing down every crack, every rust bloom, every place the metal had gone thin as paper. The Coyle grain operation sat on 240 acres outside a small farming town in central Nebraska, the kind of place where everybody's business traveled faster than the mail did. Maren had taken over the operation 18 months earlier when her husband Dale died in a combine accident that still didn't make sense to her, no matter how many times she turned it over at night. Along with the land, she'd inherited 3 grain silos older than she was. A loan the bank had extended to Dale on a handshake and a decade of trust, neither of which transferred automatically to a widow. And a 12-year-old son named Wes, who noticed everything and said very little. The center silo, the tallest of the 3, had been the operation's backbone for 40 years. It held enough corn to carry the farm through a bad harvest, enough to leverage a decent price when the market finally turned, instead of dumping grain the day it came off the field just to make ends meet. Her father-in-law used to say that silo was the difference between farming and gambling. But steel doesn't last forever, and this one had been patched and repatched by 3 different owners going back to the 70s. That spring, Maren had climbed up with a flashlight after noticing a seam of orange dust collecting at the base after every windstorm, and what she found stopped her cold. Rust had eaten through sections of the inner wall in a pattern that made no sense to her untrained eye. Deep in some spots, barely there in others, no rhyme or reason she could see.
She'd called the Agricultural Extension Office, and a structural engineer had come out for an afternoon, walked the scaffolding with a tablet, and delivered his verdict standing in the gravel drive with his hands in his pockets. The silo had maybe 2 years left before it needed to come down entirely, and a full replacement would run close to $200,000, money the operation did not have, and the bank was not inclined to lend to a widow with 1 harvest under her belt. He'd offered, not unkindly, that plenty of operations her size just switched to renting storage in town and let somebody else worry about it. Maren had thanked him and driven home, gripping the wheel the way she'd started gripping it lately, doing arithmetic in her head that never came out anywhere good. Renting storage meant selling grain the day it came off the field, at whatever price the elevator was offering that particular Tuesday, forever. It meant never getting ahead. It meant the operation her husband had built slowly shrinking until there was nothing left to hand to Wes but debt and an empty lot where 3 silos used to stand. Her problem wasn't that the silo was failing. Silos failed on old farms constantly. Everybody understood that. Her problem was that she didn't have the money to fix it the way it was supposed to be fixed, and everyone kept telling her, kindly or otherwise, that the only real answer was one she couldn't afford. It was on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the engineer's report spread out under the lamp, that Maren noticed something in his notes she'd skimmed past the first time. He'd marked the failure points not as random deterioration, but as following a pattern tied to the original construction seams, the vertical welds where sheet after sheet of steel had been joined together decades ago by whoever built the thing originally. The rust wasn't eating the silo evenly. It was concentrated almost entirely along those old seams, the places where two pieces of metal had been forced to become one and never quite finished agreeing on it. She sat with that a long while. If the failure followed the seams, then maybe the whole silo didn't need replacing. Maybe what needed replacing was just the seams themselves, reinforced from the inside with new steel bonded properly to the old, one vertical line at a time. She didn't know if that was possible. She didn't know anything about welding beyond what she'd watched Dale do 100 times without ever once picking up the torch herself. But she went out to the
machine shed the next morning and found his old welding rig still sitting exactly where he'd left it 18 months earlier, and she stood looking at it for a long time before she finally touched the switch. There was another number sitting underneath all of it that Maren didn't say out loud to anybody, not even Wes at first. The bank held a note on the equipment that Dale had signed the year before he died, and the terms were built around the assumption that the farm would keep storing and selling grain on its own timeline, the way it always had. If she lost the silo and had to switch to renting storage, the income drop would be enough that she'd miss a payment within the year, and a missed payment on that particular note gave the bank the right to call the whole balance due. That wasn't a fear sitting somewhere out in the future. It was a date on a calendar, and it sat behind every single weld Maren made that whole summer, whether she said it out loud or not. She started the very first repair on a Wednesday morning before the sun had cleared the grain bins, climbing the scaffolding with a mask, gloves 2 sizes too big that had belonged to her husband, and a rented welding rig because Dale's old one turned out to need a part nobody stocked anymore. Her first pass at the seam was ugly, a crooked bead of new metal that looked nothing like the clean lines in the videos she'd watched late into the night after Wes went to bed. It took her 4 hours to do what a professional could have done in 40 minutes, but it held. She tested it the way the engineer's notes had described, tapping along the line with a small hammer, listening for the dull thud that meant a hollow spot versus the sharp ring that meant solid metal. It rang true the whole way down. It wasn't pretty, but it was the first one, and everything that came after started right there. She didn't have money for a professional crew. What she had was a rented welding rig, a stack of steel plate bought a little at a time whenever there was cash to spare, a headlamp for the early mornings before full daylight, and Wes's notebook, a plain composition book that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this whole story, because Wes had appointed himself the record keeper without being asked, tracking every seam Maren finished, every measurement, every date, in handwriting that got steadier as the summer went on. The first 12 seams Maren welded almost entirely by feel, climbing the scaffolding before the heat set in hard, running a bead of new steel along the old seam, letting it cool, testing it with the hammer, moving to the next. She wasn't rebuilding the silo, she was reinforcing it seam by seam, line by line, the way somebody patches a coat rather than replacing the whole garment. It was slow work. It was hot, exhausting work under a metal roof in July. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again in places the calluses hadn't reached. But it meant nobody driving past on the county road could say a crew from town had done the work for her. That was when the trucks started slowing down. Gene Holleran farmed the section bordering the Coyle place, and Gene Holleran had an opinion about everything happening on land he didn't own, which around here was most things. He was the first to stop his truck at the fence and really look. "She's gonna weld that thing shut with herself still inside it," he said to whoever was riding along that afternoon, loud enough that Maren heard it clear across the yard. By the end of the week, half the county had driven past slow enough to see the sparks. Somebody started calling the operation Widow's Folly, and the name caught on fast, the way names do in a small town without much else to talk about that summer. One man leaned over the fence at the feed store and told Maren straight to her face that steelwork wasn't something you learned from a video, that she was going to bring the whole silo down on top of herself and leave her boy with nothing but a funeral and a debt. One hollered from his truck window that she ought to just sell the grain operation to somebody who knew what they were doing and kick a job in town like a sensible woman. Wes came home from school one afternoon and told his mother, without much drama in his voice, that a kid in his class had said his mom was going to blow up the farm. Maren heard nearly all of it and let most of it pass, because arguing with a joke only ever feeds it. What she didn't let pass was the afternoon she overheard Jean telling a younger farmer, dead serious, that amateur welding on a grain silo was the kind of thing that ended up on the evening news.
Evening news. That one she answered, calm and flat, standing at her own fence with her welding mask still pushed up on her forehead. "You're welcome to come climb it with me and check every seam yourself, Jean. Bring your own gloves." He didn't take her up on it. Nobody did. But it was the first time all summer she'd pushed back at all, and saying it out loud plainly made the rest of the laughter a little easier to carry. The person who finally did climb the scaffolding with her was a retired pipeline welder named Alma Delgado, 71 years old, who lived 2 towns over and had spent 40 years working steel on projects most of the men mocking Maren couldn't have named. Alma had heard about Widow's Folly through her niece who worked at the feed store, and she'd driven over unannounced one Saturday morning, parked her truck at the gate, and simply stood watching Maren work for the better part of an hour before saying a single word. When she finally spoke, it wasn't encouragement, it was correction. "Your travel speed's too fast on the vertical passes. That's why you're getting that undercut." Maren, startled, nearly dropped her hood. Alma climbed the rest of the way up without being invited and spent the next 3 hours teaching her things no video ever had: the exact angle to hold the rod, how to read the color of the molten pool to know when it was ready, how to listen to the sound of a good weld versus a bad one. Alma came back the next Saturday and the one after that, never announcing it, just appearing at the gate with her own gear in the truck bed. She never once told Maren the plan was foolish, she only ever made it better. By late July, she and Maren had reinforced 30 seams together, and Wes had started coming out after school specifically to hand Alma tools, listening to every word she said about steel and rust and patience like it was scripture. It was Alma who first noticed, running her palm along a lower section Maren had already finished, that the old plate itself was thinning dangerously in one particular quadrant, not from rust exactly, but from what she called fatigue, decades of grain settling and shifting and pressing outward in the same direction every single harvest. If they didn't address that section specifically, reinforcing the seams around it wouldn't matter, because the plate itself would eventually give way regardless of how strong the welds holding it were. That was the twist.
Nobody had accounted for. The silo wasn't just failing at its seams, it was failing at one specific point under one specific invisible kind of pressure that had been building for 40 years. And no amount of surface repair was going to fix it. Maren sat with that news at the kitchen table for 2 full days, running numbers that kept coming out the same discouraging way no matter how she arranged them. Properly reinforcing that section meant cutting out a section of original plate entirely and replacing it, work far beyond anything she'd attempted yet. Work that carried real risk if done wrong on a structure standing 60 feet in the air. Alma didn't sugarcoat the danger, but she also didn't back away from it. "You've learned more in 10 weeks than most apprentices learn in a year," she told Maren, standing in the yard with the September light going gold behind her. "The plate's not going to wait for you to feel ready. Nothing in this life ever does." They did the cutout together on a Thursday in early October, Wes standing below with the fire extinguisher and his notebook, recording every step the way Alma insisted he do, because a record like that mattered more than people realized until the day it didn't. It took them 11 hours. Maren's hands shook through the first cut and steadied completely by the last one. When they finally climbed down after dark, all three of them stood in the yard looking up at a silo that from the ground looked exactly the way it always had. But it wasn't the same structure anymore. It had been given seam by seam and plate by plate another 40 years it hadn't had that morning. The ice storm came in February, 18 months after Maren first touched that welding switch in the machine shed. It moved through the county overnight, the kind of storm that coats every wire and fence post in glass and brings down anything with a weak point waiting to be found. By morning, 2 silos on neighboring properties had partially collapsed under the accumulated weight, spilling grain and twisted metal across frozen ground, a loss that would run into 6 figures for each of those farms. The Coyle silo, the one they'd called Widow's Folly for an entire summer, stood exactly as it had the day before, ice sheeting off its reinforced seams the way it was built to.
Jean Halloran was the one who drove over first, parking at the gate the same way Alma once had, standing there a long moment before he finally came through it. He stood looking up at the silo with his cap in his hands, and when Maren came out to meet him, he didn't say anything about mosquitoes or funerals or sensible jobs in town. He asked, quiet enough that it clearly wasn't meant to travel any further than the 2 of them, how she'd known which sections needed the extra work before the storm ever came. Maren told him the truth. She hadn't known, not at the start. She'd only known that the rust was following a pattern, and that a pattern was something you could study instead of something you just had to accept. Word travels fast in a county that small, and it travels faster once the man who started every joke is the one standing at the gate asking a real question instead of making one. A few other operations with aging storage started calling not long after that, quietly at first, then less quietly once the spring newsletter from the county extension office ran a short piece about the Coyle silo as a case study in low-cost structural reinforcement. Alma still came out most Saturdays, though slower now, 73 and content to sit on an overturned bucket, directing rather than climbing herself. And by then, Wes, 14 and steady-handed, could run a clean vertical bead almost as well as his mother could, tapping each finished seam with the small hammer, listening for that sharp, true ring, writing the result in a notebook that had by then filled 3 full volumes in his own increasingly confident handwriting. The neighbors had always believed Maren Coyle welded a silo back together out of stubbornness and nothing else. What she'd actually built, one crooked bead at a time, starting the year she buried her husband and had every reason in the world to walk away, was proof that the thing everyone assumed was finished could still be listened to, studied, and saved if somebody was willing to climb up and find out for themselves. This is what quiet competence often looks like from the outside, unglamorous, slow, and easy to mistake for foolishness right up until the moment it holds when everything else doesn't. The real lesson in stories like this one isn't about welding or farming at all. It's about paying close attention to the patterns everyone else has already decided aren't worth studying, and trusting that patience applied consistently is its own kind of expertise.